and thanks for having me on this panel on encountering alien otherness. My name is Katharina Donn. I'm an independent researcher living in London. I also work in secondary schools. I got my PhD back in Germany. But overall, what I'm interested in my research, which is very much focused on 20th century and 21st century American literature, is how we can use literature and the imaginative mode to think through these very convoluted and complex and complicated contemporaneity that we all inhabit. And I'm doing this, of course, from a very decidedly eco-critical perspective. However, I started out in my academic career actually with more of a focus in memory studies. So my first book was on trauma literature after 9/11, which already had a strong focus on embodiment and corporeality. And this is really what drove my interest now in more broadly the politics of contemporary literature. So my second book was on that topic, came out last year. And today I'm here with a paper titled A Monstrous Future, Metamorphosing Bodies in Speculative Fiction. And what I'm interested in here is really this concept of the monstrous, which we associate more with perhaps the grotesque, perhaps folkloric tales, perhaps mythology. But I'm interested in how we can use these sort of monstrous figures to infuse 21st century posthumanism with more of a sense of matter and embodiment and corporeality that sometimes it perhaps lacks. And here I'm also interested in how some examples of speculative fiction, contemporary speculative fiction, use this mix of the posthuman and the monstrous to imagine modes of surviving in a more sustainable manner than perhaps is currently the case. So I'm just going to get started here with my introduction on disentangling the monstrous and the posthuman. What does it mean to be human in the era called the Anthropocene, when being human, whatever this means, has become sedimented in the geological makeup of the planet? More urgently, how can we reconfigure the human, given how destructive this human impact is? How can we rethink such enmeshment into a narrative that's more future-oriented? In short, what figurations of being human might promise emergence instead of succumbing to the doom of the self-made apocalypse? So these are the basic questions that I'm going to address in this paper. I'm going to explore them through the lens of creatures that are not only non-human, but might seem antagonizing and anti-human at first, the monstrous posthuman. The monster embodies both breakdown and emergence. While it is traditionally read as a symptom of collapse and chaos, fulfilling its etymologically prescribed role as a dark omen, I'm interested in the alternative route from which these hybrid changeable creatures emanate. The monster not only evokes the Latin monere, giving warnings, but also monstrare, to show. To speak with Donna Haraway, monsters demonstrate. At this point, it might also be worth clarifying that I'm focusing on the monster as sort of an imaginative, very much embodied figure. I'm emphatically not using it in its metaphoric sense to denote psychopathic murderers or other perpetrators of the kind of violence that are actually fundamentally all too human. Monsters prowl the lands where the world breaks down, and nowhere more so than in the spaces of science fiction, which teem with untamed life. Yet despite the outrageous appearance of many sci-fi creatures, their imaginative horizons actually remain quite limited. Even where the conceptual setup promises much, mainstream science fiction often straitjackets its post-human creatures into narrative patterns much too narrow for their own creative potentials, which basically link to the whole doom of the apocalypse, the lone fight of a hero to remain victorious, the threat of extinction, the need to exterminate or extinguish others with clear lines of exclusion, of clear lines of us versus them. For example, much as the replicants in the recently revived Blade Runner movies try to echo Mary Shelley's rebellious monster, respond to ecological breakdown, and are tuned into the power of poetry as well as a distinctive post-human thirst for connectivity with their selves being interlinked, the narrative ultimately remains caught in the age-old hero-monster tale. Both sides unleash violence upon each other until the hero and monster are revealed as what they truly are, flip sides of the same destructive force drenched in blood and swords. This line of tradition, be it post-human or folkloric, shores up the vulnerable, fragile, small human body into an impregnable fortress. That this pattern can be found in tales ranging from Beowulf to 21st century sci-fi might be anthropologically fascinating, and it's certainly much to say about the universal human fascination with monsters. I wonder though whether all this unleashing of violence is not also a blind spot which actually conceals the truly innovative power of the monstrous. In speculative fiction, this future-oriented thrust of the monstrous is often of an ecological nature. Given famous precursors such as Mary Shelley's monster, whose proposals of a vegan lifestyle in harmony with his fellow creatures receive a rather hostile reception on the part of its human creator, such a re-evaluation actually has a long tradition, with which writers, including Rita Indiana, who I'm going to look at today, rework in the 21st century vein of a biopunk posthumanism. The decidedly ethical and ecological thrust of such fiction, especially in Rita Indiana's quite feminist and queer biopunk fiction, demonstrates how science fiction genres have changed since the earlier days of the more conventionally cyberpunk, and I quote, virtual realities and digital escapism, which, as Carl and Levine rightly points out, tended to be dominated by, and I quote her again, a white middle-class heterosexual and very male perspective, end quote. While 1980s cyberpunk was often marked by patriarchal subtexts, these writers are more closely aligned with the science fiction of Octavia Butler or Marge Piercy, exploring the virtual alongside the ecological or the biotechnological. Their environmentally and technologically gritty fictional worlds expose the post-human subject to be a work in progress, to quote Rosie Braidotti, in her embodied sense of posthumanism, experiencing subjectivity to be a relational, rhizomatic capacity. In such texts, the motif of skin crystallizes enmeshment as a fierce, ferocious condition. It functions as a site which engenders alternatives to the kind of transhumanism which seeks unassailability, as defined by Nick Bostrom in the Transhumanist FAQ of the World Transhumanist Association. These texts are instead responsive to Donna Haraway's call for a language able to, and I quote her, insist on noise and advocate pollution, end quote, which of course must not be misunderstood as a celebration of infection or toxicity. It's rather a call to unsettle normative categories and boundaries of human selfhood, creating a mode of speculative writing specifically attuned to a world in crisis. My paper proposes that hybrid biopunk bodies offer figurations not only of survival on a toxic and wounded planet, but of human life lived according to the principles of enmeshment and porosity, rather than dominance and exploitation. On a narrative level, this points to a pathway beyond the dead end of the hero-villain patterns which shape conventional science fiction. Yet on a political level, this also raises the possibility of a different kind of future-oriented imagination that's not placed on sort of the no-place isles of conventional utopia, but on the rhizomatic currents running through what I'm going to call a diatopia, sort of crossing through topos, a literary and ecological space defined by transversal and border crossings. Unsurprisingly for speculative fiction, this leads to a weird and wonderful entanglements between the post-human and the monstrous, a conceptual point that's worth lingering on for just a moment. This is not to say that the post-human and the monstrous are interchangeable, far from it. They might have in common a transgressive push. They are both more than the human, with amorphous bodies whose combinations and recombinations are lived friction zones of connectivity and difference. And while the monstrous has a stronger affinity with human-animal chimeras, while the post-human embraces the machinic or digital, both share hybridity as their principle of life. The monstrous is interesting within the context of a 21st century speculative fiction, which is firmly situated within a position of breakdown, toxicity and vulnerability, not only for what has been traditionally seen as its potential to sort of both lure and repulse, for fear and fascination. The position I'm interested in is not the stance of the human confronted with the monster. It's the perspective that comes with inhabiting monstrous bodies, which is the stance that gave fame and subjectivity, of course, to Mary Shelley's creature, and which is the stance that contemporary writers experiment with. The monstrous, as it comes to us in folkloric tales, mythological contexts or Gothic fictions, is anything but docile. Emerging in lands of the unknowable, mythological monsters are hybrid creatures, often half animal and half human. In an eco-critical context, several features of the monstrous are worth emphasizing. Monsters are assemblages per se, not single species. Thinking monstrously means that the idea of unispecies progress, destroying others, becomes impossible. What's more, they're fertile. They like to spawn and hatch. This creative impulse of emergence is deeply embedded in monstrous natures who shape new forms and organic entities capable of life in art and in the imagination. While in the late Middle Ages, Bosch and Bruegel might have used the monstrous to explore God's fecund imagination, I'm more interested in their ability to, and I quote Gilmore here, to fuse opposites, to merge contraries, to subvert rules, to overthrow cognitive barriers, moral distinctions and ontological categories, end quote. From a perspective of imaginative emergence, monsters are powerful, but their power is unlike the notion of domination that underlies the human exploitation of nature. Given 21st century realities, this seems immediately apt. As Stacey Alaimo reminds me, and I quote her, "The Anthropocene is no time to set things straight," end quote. Such enmeshed and interbleeding figures might therefore provide the necessary creative experiments for how to rethink and re-experience human life beyond the tendency, quote again, to hyper-separate ourselves from natures beyond our own. Such inability or unwillingness to imagine one's own entanglement entails what Haraway describes as, and I quote her, the astralization of the bounded self, beyond the networks of consequence and interconnectedness of the world, a tendency which remains very much alive in everyday culture. However, not all posthumanisms or monstrosities have such a future-oriented impulse. And there are some key differences which have motivated me to seek out the monstrous in the posthuman, or to put it differently, to infuse the posthuman with some of the energies of the monstrous. This has to do with how the posthuman, in some of its cyborg forms, tends towards this embodiment. An operation, for example, described by Hans Moravec as early as 1988, serves well to illustrate this strand of posthumanism. He creates a fictional scene and imagines a robot surgeon excavating a human brain layer by layer, a neural signal at a time, until all that is left is an empty skull shell. The human mind in this scenario has been transferred to an artificial cyborg body, tailor-made to any preferences, while the organic body, emptied of its subjectivity, is left to rot, discarded on the operating table. Such a perfected, portable posthuman mind is therefore a disembodied mind. Yet, treating the body as a mere prosthesis, to borrow Catherine Hale's critical phrase, not only privileges informational patterns over their material instantiation, it regulates the human body by tailoring and honing its life to fit the requirements of a machine, which tips a precarious ethical scale irrevocably towards the creation of, and I quote, manageable subjects, end quote. So that's a quote by Jonathan Crary. In contrast to the riotous and often unreadable embodiment of the monster, which challenges the very categories we normally use to sort of read or respond to the world, the posthuman in this disembodied form is fully and smoothly coded, its legibility opening it to exploitation. It's hardly a surprise, therefore, that disembodied posthuman figures tend to lose their strands of self-determination and their rebellious streak. If anything is radical about that, it is how tameable, how docile they often are, such as, to go back to the Blade Runner example, the artificial intelligence women who serve their male owners every need. I'm therefore interested in exploring whether and how figurations who retain their own hybrid embodiment can break this link between enslavement and post-human being, or between exploitation and the post-human. The pre-digital concept of the monstrous can help me conceptually to articulate such a post-humanism, which opens up towards emergence instead of collapsing into yet more dead ends of power and exploitation. So how can we entangle the post-human and the monstrous to create more fertile ground for imagining a more sustainable human existence? In asking this question, I'm aligning myself with the kind of eco-posthumanism whose most prominent proponent remains Donna Haraway, whose cyborgs emerge from the generative regrowth of salamander limbs. This is no coincidence. Such creative, to quote, a bestiality frees the post-human from the myth of a male creator, making them instead figurations of what Stacey Alaimo terms the transcorporeal. It presupposes that all embodied beings are enmeshed within a dynamic world which traverses them, changes them, and is shaped by them. As borderlines between inside and outside become increasingly porous, such bodily being begins to enmesh the human within non-human ecologies. This certainly also retains a loss of control, as well as a loss of the sense of bounded personhood and the myth of free will. Transcorporeal subjectivities are not masters over their own destinies, nor over their own bodies. But this idea does open the human body to enmeshment, introducing an ethical position of shared consequence. In such entanglements with more than human life, to quote Singh and Swanson in their 2017 book, we humans too are monsters. And I'm now going to move into a short reading of the novel Tentacle by Rita Indiana. And I'm going to start this with again a quote by Anna Singh. What if all organisms, including humans, are tangled up with each other? End quote. As she asks in the introduction to a volume exploring the potentials of the monstrous in conceptualizing a more sustainable vision of human life. Rita Indiana's novel Tentacle, translated in 2018, explores precisely such entanglements. It's set in a near future of 2024, and Indiana describes the Dominican Republic in the throes of ecological breakdown. The toxic aftermath of a tidal wave has left the Caribbean as a marine graveyard teeming with, and I quote her, unsalvageable corpses and sudden junk, end quote. In a connection between ecological and human health, it seems especially poignant when read during the current pandemic. Rampant viruses threaten human life as part of a species extinction which this speculative yet eerily recognizable world is facing. With society starkly divided, refugees fleeing from the quarantine imposed on whole sections of islands such as Haiti face virus scans executed by the artificial intelligence inbuilt into upscale residential blocks. The very buildings housing the well-off and uninfected will release lethal gases on the vulnerable, only to then summon automatic collectors to deposit the body, dead or alive, and I quote, with all the diligence of a gluttonous child picking up dirty candy from the floor, end quote. Thus cleansing themselves from the sick and circumstantially also from the homeless, the mentally ill or prostitutes, those who can afford it have erected secondary epidemic structures imbued with merciless agency. Equating immunity with impenetrability, this seems a really problematic manifestation actually of sort of trying to shore up the individual body. However, Rita Indiana's vision then begins to change this sort of question of boundary and epidermis and skin from boundary to a more interstitial space by introducing a radically porous body into these fortressed housing cells. One of the self-protecting fenced-off residential fortresses is occupied, precariously so, by Astilde, a former prostitute pursuing the dream of becoming an Italian chef, and, in the meantime, lifting weights to shape their body into a more masculine form. Thus, they bide their time until they can afford to buy a Rainbow Bride, a one-injection gender reassignment drug. With digital apps embedded in their skin, they sport some of the more expected trappings of a post-human figure. More striking, though, is a different feature of their appearance. Astilde's forehead reveals a crown of moles. These dark dots on their skin are not blemishes nor mere marks. They are gateways between human, marine, and pantheistic dimensions of life, although this is only gradually revealed. Esther, Astilde's employer, has not taken Astilde on as a maid because of their housekeeping skills. Otherwise named Zomin Kunle, Esther is a religious advisor to the President of the Dominican Republic and is named after the cloak that covers the sea, devoted to the Yoruba goddess of the ocean. She has recognized Astilde by the crown of moles as Omo Olokun, the one who knows what lies at the bottom of the sea, and who is tasked with saving the ocean. Protected in her flat, her workshop takes a scientific turn as she carefully monitors the life rhythms and nutrition of a rare surviving sea anemone. In the course of the novel, this sea creature and Astilde enter into a symbiotic relation which will shift the foundations of human embodiment, agency, and subjectivity. The entry point into such human ecological symbiosis is the moment when the synthetic drug Rainbow Bride is administered. In a conflagration of biotechnology, non-human ecology, and the human body typical of the genre. In the moment of injection, Astilde's body begins to grow fluid, their skin seething and their breasts filling with smoky bubbles. They are shedding skin. The, and I quote, wrinkled web that looked like gum around her nipple, once removed, reveals, and I quote, a masculine skin growing underneath. In Tentacle, epidemic matter does not shield or define an individual body. Instead, making her stretching skin bleed, it is transformative, able to reconfigure itself until it bestows new boundaries to a changed body, covering every altered centimetre of flesh. This, however, is no surgically enhanced layer of protection. Indeed, Indiana evokes the idea of a secure epidemic layer only to subvert it, even more radically than her toxin-laden environments could. Even in ASLE's new shape, their crown of moth remains and becomes the gateway for human-animal symbiosis. In the most significant moment of the novel, Mikunle's friend Eric attaches the sea anemone's tentacles to ASLE's molds. Once touching, the tentacles stay put as though with Velcro. Whilst Eric is already succumbing to the sea anemone's lethal poison for ASLE, the marine creature's touch bestows new life. This momentary union with the sea creature opens up ASLE's selfhood to several temporal and spatial dimensions. Channels emerge from this subjectivity, branching out into the pre-apocalyptic times of the year 1991, where ASLE is welcomed by the locals as the great lord and envoy, having emerged through an oceanic cave of sea anemones from the land of the beginning. Whilst they begin the work of preventing the ecological breakdown of the Pacific Ocean, in the 1990s, their 2027 self, they are recognised with incredulity as, and I quote, "The little queer who's going to save the country," end quote, rests in a calm and relative comfort of a prison cell. This affords them the safety and time needed to shape their branched off extra body in the identity of one Giorgio Menikucci, who works with his marine biologist wife to fund and conduct the research that would eventually allow the Caribbean coral reefs to be repopulated. Nevertheless, this is not a hero-savior narrative. All of ASLE's increasingly numerous identities are sometimes grittily violent, sometimes slightly overwhelmed, sometimes self-indulgent, and never truly selfless. Yet this symbiotic multiple body, with its human, oceanic, and pantheistic offshoots, is the most powerful source of agency within a world in seemingly incontrovertible breakdown. This epidemic gateway in the novel's oceanic context suggests skin to form a key site for negotiating what Rita Indiana describes as the fundamental ambivalence of bodies, of water fluid bodies, monstrous bodies in that sense. They oscillate between the collective thrust of being floodable on the one hand, and the distinct qualities of each body on the other hand as a me, of me, yet beyond me. Such openness entails utter unknowability and uncontrollability, and challenges the idea of agency and free will. Yet in this exposure to currents which are potentially unwelcome, or might also be life-giving, it has also a strong ethical call to commit to a collective worlding. Indeed, the symbiotic body is advantageously positioned to address such an interpenetrated, enmeshed ethical agency. And I quote, "Against the conceit of the individual, Monstrous highlights symbiosis, as the editors of Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet suggest. Such a perspective on the monstrous as a figure of ecological entanglement not only offers a pathway beyond the premise of bounded individuality as a core tenet of life, unsettling the centre stage position of the human, just as the anemone's touch unsettles ASLE, might also open an ethical pathway of living on a pandemic planet beyond the hierarchical, competitive zero-sum game of impenetrable selfhood. Understanding agency to emerge from within the entanglements of such sort of monstrous post-human bodies suggests an ethic of living with, akin to the biological symbiogenesis, the co-making of living things, which Anna Tsing and her collaborators perceive in their symbiotic model of evolution. To reiterate just one thing, such entanglement should not be misunderstood as an acceptance or even a welcoming of viral or toxic threats. That's not what it is. What's so evocative about Rita Indiana's speculative world is that the pantheistic folkloric power of the ocean, as understood as a deity, moves hand in hand with the building of a laboratory that farms and replants coral in an effort to defend against toxins. And even ASLE's transformation is a co-creation between a synthetic drug and an organic marine animal. Entanglement does not demand the humble acceptance of the hemlock cup of viral and toxic poison. Quite to the contrary. It is in ethics always, to quote Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble, unquote, looking to foster human and non-human life in all its forms. Letting go of prioritising the human, in this sense, might give humanity the best chance of survival given our bodily makeup as assemblages of human, microbial and other matter. And I'm going to end here. Thank you so much for listening.